A bubble of ridiculous, panicky laughter escaped her lips. The night was turning out to be the least romantic of her life. Colin looked at her sharply, one arrogant brow raised in question. It's nothing, Penelope said. He squeezed her hand, although not terribly affectionately. I want to know, he said. She shrugged, fatalistically. She couldn't imagine what she could do or say to make the night any worse than it already was. I was just thinking about how this evening was supposed to be romantic. It could have been, he said cruelly. His hand slipped from its position at her waist, but he held on to her other hand, grasping her fingers lightly to weave her through the crowd until they stepped through the French doors out onto the terrace. Not here, Penelope whispered, glancing anxiously back toward the ballroom. He didn't even dignify her comment with a reply, instead pulling her farther into the inky night, drifting around a corner until they were quite alone. But they didn't stop there. With a quick glance to make sure that no one was about, Colin pushed open a small, unobtrusive side door. What's this? Penelope asked. His answer was a little shove at the small of her back until she was fully inside the dark hallway. Up, he said, motioning to the steps. Penelope didn't know whether to be scared or thrilled, but she climbed the stairs anyway, ever aware of Colin's hot presence right at her back. After they had climbed several flights, Colin stepped ahead of her and pushed open a door, peeking out into the hall. It was empty, so he stepped out, pulling her along with him, dashing quietly through the hall, which Penelope now recognized as the family's private chambers, until they reached a room she had never before entered. Colin's room. She had always known where it was, through all her years of coming here to visit with Eloise. She'd never once done more than trail her fingers along the heavy wood of the door. It had been years since he'd lived here at number 5 on a permanent basis, but his mother had insisted upon maintaining his room for him. One never knew when he might need it, she said, and she'd been proven right earlier that season when Colin had returned from Cyprus without a house under lease. He pushed open the door and pulled her inside after him, but the room was dark and she was stumbling, and when she stopped moving, it was because his body was right there in front of hers. He touched her arms to steady her, but then he didn't let go, just held her there in the dark. It wasn't an embrace, not really, but the length of her body was touching the length of his. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel him, and she could smell him, and she could hear his breathing, swirling through the night air, gently caressing her cheek. It was agony. It was ecstasy. His hands slid slowly down her bare arms, torturing her every nerve, and then abruptly he stepped away, followed by silence. Penelope wasn't sure what she had expected. He would yell at her, he would berate her, he would order her to explain herself, but he was doing none of those things. He was just standing there in the dark, forcing the issue, forcing her to say something. Could you light a candle? She finally asked. You don't like the dark? He drawled. Not now, not like this. I see, he murmured. So you're saying you might like it like this? His fingers were suddenly on her skin, trailing along the edges of her bodice, and then they were gone. Don't, she said, her voice shaking. Don't touch you? His voice grew mocking, and Penelope was glad that she couldn't see his face. But you are mine, aren't you? Not yet, she warned. Oh, but you are. You saw to that. It was rather clever timing, actually, waiting until our engagement ball to make your final announcement. You knew I didn't want you to publish that last column. I forbade it. We agreed. We never agreed. He ignored her outburst. You waited until we never agreed. Penelope cried out again, needing to make it clear that she had not broken her word. Whatever else she had done, she had not lied to him. Well, aside from keeping Whistledown a secret for nearly a dozen years. But he certainly hadn't been alone in that deception. And yes, she admitted, because it didn't seem right to start lying now. I knew you wouldn't jilt me, but I hoped. Her voice broke, and she was unable to finish. You hoped what? Colin asked after an interminable silence. I hoped that you would forgive me, she whispered, or at least that you would understand. I always thought you were the sort of man who— What sort of man? He asked, this time after the barest hint of a pause. It's my fault, really, she said, sounding tired and sad. I put you on a pedestal. You've been so nice all these years. I suppose I thought you were incapable of anything else. What the hell have I done that hasn't been nice? He demanded. I've protected you. I've offered for you. I've— You haven't tried to see this from my point of view, she interrupted. Because you're acting like an idiot, he nearly roared. There was silence after that, the kind of silence that grates at ears, gnaws at souls. I can't imagine what else there is to say, Penelope finally said. Colin looked away. He didn't know why he did so. It wasn't as if he could see her in the dark anyway, but there was something about the tone of her voice that made him uneasy. She sounded vulnerable, tired, wishful, and heartbroken. She made him want to understand her, or at least to try, even though he knew she had made a terrible mistake. Every little catch in her voice put a damper on his fury. He was still angry, but somehow he'd lost the will to display it. You are going to be found out, you know, he said, his voice low and controlled. You have humiliated Cressida. She will be beyond furious, and she's not going to rest until she unearths the real Lady Whistledown. Penelope moved away. He could hear her skirts rustling. Cressida isn't bright enough to figure me out, and besides, I'm not going to write any more columns. So there will be no opportunity for me to slip up and reveal something. There was a beat of silence, and then she added, You have my promise on that. It's too late, he said. It's not too late, she protested. No one knows. No one knows but you. And you're so ashamed of me, I can't bear it. Oh, for the love of God, Penelope, he snapped. I'm not ashamed of you. Would you please light a candle? She wailed. Colin crossed the room and fumbled in a drawer for a candle and the means with which to light it. I am not ashamed of you, he reiterated, but I do think you're acting foolishly. You may be correct, she said, but I have to do what I think is right. You're not thinking, he said dismissively, turning and looking at her face as he sparked a flame. Forget if you will, although I cannot. What will happen to your reputation if people find out who you really are? Forget that people will cut you, that they will talk about you behind your back. Those people aren't worth worrying about, she said, her back ramrod straight. Perhaps not, he agreed, crossing his arms and staring at her hard. But it will hurt. You will not like it, Penelope, and I won't like it. She swallowed convulsively. Good. Maybe he was getting through to her. But forget all of that, he continued. You have spent the last decade insulting people, offending them. I have said lots of very nice things as well, she protested, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. Of course you have, but those aren't the people you are going to have to worry about. I'm talking about the angry ones, the insulted ones. He strode forward and grabbed her by her upper arms. Penelope, he said urgently, there will be people who want to hurt you. His words had been meant for her, but they turned around and pierced his own heart. He tried to picture a life without Penelope. It was impossible. Just 2 weeks ago she'd been... He stopped, thought. What had she been? A friend? An acquaintance? Someone he saw and never really noticed? And now she was his fiancée, soon to be his bride. And maybe she was something more than that. Something deeper, something even more precious. What I want to know, he asked, deliberately forcing the conversation back on topic so his mind wouldn't wander down such dangerous roads, is why you're not jumping on the perfect alibi if the point is to remain anonymous. Because remaining anonymous isn't the point, she fairly yelled. You want to be found out? He asked, gaping at her in the candlelight. No, of course not, she replied. But this is my work. This is my life's work. This is all I have to show for my life. And if I can't take the credit for it, I'll be damned if someone else will. Colin opened his mouth to offer a retort, but to his surprise, he had nothing to say. Life's work. Penelope had a life's work. He did not. She might not be able to put her name on her work, but when she was alone in her room, she could look at her back issues and point to them and say to herself, this is it. This is what my life has been about. Colin, she whispered, clearly startled by his silence. She was amazing. He didn't know he hadn't realized it before, when he'd already known that she was smart and lovely and witty and resourceful. But all those adjectives and a whole host more he hadn't yet thought of did not add up to the true measure of her. She was amazing, and he was, dear God above, he was jealous of her. I'll go, she said softly, turning and walking toward the door. For a moment he didn't react. His mind was still frozen, reeling with revelations. But when he saw her hand on the doorknob, he knew he could not let her go. Not this night, not ever. No, he said hoarsely, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. No, he said again, I want you to stay. She looked up at him, her eyes 2 pools of confusion. But you said... He cut her face tenderly with his hands. Forget what I said. And that was when he realized that Daphne had been right. His love hadn't been a thunderbolt from the sky. It had started with a smile, a word, a teasing glance. Every second he had spent in her presence it had grown, until he'd reached this moment, and he suddenly knew. He loved her. He was still furious with her for publishing that last column, and he was bloody ashamed of himself that he was actually jealous of her for having found a life's work and purpose. But even with all that, he loved her. And if he let her walk out the door right now, he would never forgive himself. Maybe this, then, was the definition of love. When you wanted someone, needed her, adored her still, even when you were utterly furious and quite ready to tie her to the bed just to keep her from growing out and making some trouble. This was the night. This was the moment. He was brimming with emotion, and he had to tell her. He had to show her. Stay, he whispered, and he pulled her to him roughly, hungrily, without apology or explanation. Stay, he said again, leading her to his bed, and when she didn't say anything, he said it for a third time. Stay. She nodded. He took her into his arms. This was Penelope, and this was love. The moment Penelope nodded, the moment before she nodded really, she knew that she had agreed to more than a kiss. She wasn't sure what had made Colin change his mind, why he had been so angry one minute and then so loving and tender the next. She wasn't sure, but the truth was she didn't care. One thing she knew, he wasn't doing this, kissing her so sweetly to punish her. Some men might use desire as a weapon, temptation as revenge. But Colin wasn't one of them. It just wasn't in him. He was, for all his rakish and mischievous ways, for all his jokes and teasing and sly humor, a good and noble man, and he would be a good and noble husband. She knew this as well as she knew herself. And if he was kissing her passionately, lowering her to his bed, covering her body with his own, then it was because he wanted her, cared enough to overcome his anger, cared for her. Penelope kissed him back with every ounce of her emotion, every last corner of her soul. She had years and years of love for this man, and what she lacked in technique she made up in fervor. She clutched at his hair, writhed beneath him, unmindful of her own appearance. They weren't in a carriage or his mother's drawing room this time. There was no fear of discovery, no need to make sure that she looked presentable in 10 minutes. This was a night she could show him everything she felt for him. She would answer his desire with her own and silently make her vows of love and fidelity and devotion. When the night was through, he would know that she loved him. She might not say the words, she might not even whisper them, but he would know, or maybe he already knew. It was funny. It had been so easy to hide her secret life as Lady Whistledown, but so unbelievably hard to keep her heart from her eyes every time she looked at him. When did I start needing you so much? He whispered, raising his head very slightly from hers until the tips of their noses touched and she could see his eyes, dark and colorless in the dim light, but so very green in her mind, focusing on hers. His breath was hot, and his gaze was hot, and he was making her feel hot in areas of her body she never even allowed herself to think about. His fingers moved to the back of her gown, moving expertly along the buttons until she felt the fabric loosening, first around her breasts, then around her ribs, then around her waist, and then it wasn't even there at all. My God, he said, his voice a mere shadow louder than breath. You're so beautiful. And for the first time in her life, Penelope truly believed that it might be true. There was something very wicked and titillating about being so intimately bared before another human being, but she didn't feel shame. Colin was looking at her so warmly, touching her so reverently, that she could feel nothing but an overwhelming sense of destiny. His fingers skimmed along the sensitive skin at the outside edge of her breasts, first teasing her with his fingernails, then stroking her more gently as his fingertips returned to their original position near her collarbone. Something tightened within her. She didn't know if it was his touch or the way he was looking at her, but something was making her change. She felt strange, odd, wonderful. He was kneeling on the bed beside her, still fully clothed, gazing down at her with a sense of pride, of desire, of ownership. "I never dreamed you would look like this," he whispered, moving his hand until his palm was lightly grazing her nipple. "I never dreamed I would want you this way." Penelope sucked in her breath as a spasm of sensation shot through her, but something in his words was unsettling, and he must have seen her reaction in her eyes, because he asked, "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing," she started to say, then checked herself. Their marriage ought to be based on honesty, and she did neither of them a service by withholding her true feelings. "What did you think I would look like?" she asked quietly. He just stared at her, clearly confused by her question. "You said you never dreamed I would look this way," she explained. "What did you think I would look like?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Until the last few weeks, honestly, I don't think I thought about it." "And since then?" she persisted, not quite sure why she needed him to answer, just knowing that she did. In one swift moment he straddled her, then leaned down until the fabric of his waistcoat scraped her belly and breasts, until his nose touched hers and his hot breath swarmed across her skin. "Since then," he growled, "I've thought of this moment 1,000 times, pictured 100 different pairs of breasts, all lovely and desirable and full and begging for my attention, but nothing, and let me repeat this in case you didn't quite hear me the first time, nothing comes close to reality." "Oh," it was really all she could think to say. He shrugged off his jacket and waistcoat until he was clad only in his fine linen shirt and breeches, then did nothing but stare at her, a wicked, wicked smile lifting one corner of his lips as she squirmed beneath him, growing hot and hungry under his relentless gaze. And then, just when she was certain that she couldn't take it for one more second, he reached out and covered her with both his hands, squeezing lightly as he tested the weight and shape of her. He moaned raggedly, then sucked in his breath as he adjusted his fingers so that her nipples popped up between them. "I want to see you sitting up," he groaned, "so I can see them full and lovely and large. And then I want to crawl behind you and to cup you." His hips found her ear, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "All I want to do." "It's in front of a mirror." "Now?" she squeaked. He seemed to consider that for a moment, then shook his head. "Later," he said, and then repeated it in a rather resolute tone. "Later." Penelope opened her mouth to ask him something. She had no idea what, but before she could utter a word, he murmured, "First things first," and he lowered his mouth to her breast, teasing her first with a soft rush of air, then closing his lips around her, chuckling softly as she yelled in surprise and bucked off the bed. He continued this torture until she thought she might scream. Then he moved to the other breast and repeated it all over again. But this time he'd freed up one of his hands, and it seemed to be everywhere, teasing, tempting, tickling. It was on her belly, then on her hip, then on her ankle, sliding up under her skirt. Colin, Penelope gasped, squirming beneath him as his fingers stroked the delicate skin behind her knee. Are you trying to get away or come closer? He murmured, his lips never once leaving her breast. I don't know. He lifted his head and smiled down at her, wolfishly. Good. He climbed off of her and slowly removed the remainder of his clothing. First his fine linen shirt, and then his boots and breeches. And all the while he never once allowed his eyes to stray from hers. When he was done, he nudged her dress, already pooling about her waist, around her hips, his fingers pressing lightly against her soft bottom as he lifted her up to slide the fabric under her. She was left before him in nothing but her sheer, whisper-soft stockings. He paused then and smiled. Too much of a man not to enjoy the view, then eased them from her legs, letting them flitter to the floor after he'd slid them over her toes. She was shivering in the night air, so he lay beside her, pressing his body to hers, infusing her with his warmth as he savored the silky softness of her skin. He needed her. It was humbling how much he needed her. He was hard, hot, and so desperately racked with desire. It was a wonder he could still see straight. And yet, even as his body screamed for release, he was possessed of a strange calm, an unexpected sense of control. Somewhere along the way, this had ceased to be about him. It was about her. No, it was about them, about this wondrous joining and miraculous love that he was only now beginning to appreciate. He wanted her. God above, he wanted her. But he wanted her to tremble beneath him, to scream with desire, to thrash her head from side to side as he teased her toward completion. He wanted her to love this, to love him, and to know when they were lying in each other's arms, sweaty and spent, that she belonged to him, because he already knew that he belonged to her. Tell me if I do anything you don't like, he said, surprised by the way his voice was shaking over his words. You couldn't, she whispered, touching his cheek. She didn't understand. It almost made him smile. Probably would have made him smile if he weren't so concerned with making this, her first experience, a good one. But her whispered words, you couldn't, could mean only one thing, that she had no idea what it meant to make love with a man. Penelope, he said softly, covering her hand with his own. I need to explain something to you. I could hurt you. I would never mean to, but I could. And she shook her head. You couldn't, she said again. I know you. Sometimes I think I know you better than I know myself, and you would never do anything that would hurt me. He gritted his teeth and tried not to groan. Not on purpose, he said, the barest hint of exasperation tinging his voice. But I could, and let me be the judge, she said. taking his hand and bringing it to her mouth for a single, heartfelt kiss. And as for the other, what other? She smiled, and Colin had to blink, because he could swear she almost looked as if she were amused by him. You told me to tell you if you did anything I didn't like, she said. He watched her face closely, suddenly mesmerized by the way her lips were forming words. I promise you, she vowed, I will like it all. A strange bubble of joy began to rise within him. He didn't know what benevolent God had chosen to bestow her upon him, but he was thinking that he needed to be a bit more attentive next time he went to church. I will like it all, she said again, because I am with you. He took her face in his hands, gazing down at her as if she were the most wondrous creature ever to walk the earth. I love you, she whispered. I've loved you for years. I know, he said, surprising himself with his words. He had known, he supposed, but he'd thrust it from his mind because her love made him uncomfortable. It was hard to be loved by someone decent and good when you didn't return the emotion. He couldn't dismiss her because he liked her and he didn't, and he'd not have been able to forgive himself if he'd trampled on her emotions, and he couldn't flirt with her for much the same reasons. And so he had told himself that what she felt wasn't really love. It had been easier to try to convince himself that she was merely infatuated with him, that she didn't understand what true love was, as if he did, and that eventually she would find someone else and settle down into a happy and contented life. Now that thought, that she might have married another, nearly left him paralyzed with fear. They were side by side, and she was staring at him with her heart in her eyes, her entire face alive with happiness and contentment, as if she finally felt free now that she had spoken those words. And he finally realized that her expression held not one trace of expectation. She hadn't told him she loved him simply to hear his reply. She wasn't even waiting for his answer. She had told him she loved him simply because she wanted to, because that was what she felt. I love you too, he whispered, pressing an intense kiss against her lips before moving away so that he could see her reaction. Penelope gazed at him for a very long while before responding. Finally, with an odd, convulsive swallow, she said, You don't have to say that just because I did. I know, he replied, smiling. She just looked at him, her widening eyes the only movement on her face. And you know that too, he said softly. You said you know me better than you know myself, or yourself, and you know I would never say the words if I didn't mean them. And as she lay there naked in his bed, cradled in his embrace, Penelope realized that she did know. Colin didn't lie, not about anything important, and she couldn't imagine anything more important than the moment they were sharing. He loved her. It wasn't anything she'd expected, nor anything she'd even allowed herself to hope for. And yet, here it was, like a bright and shining miracle in her heart. Are you sure? She whispered. He nodded, his arms drawing closer. I realized it this evening when I asked you to stay. How? But she didn't even finish the question because she wasn't even really sure what the question was. How did he know he loved her? How had it happened? How did it make him feel? But somehow he must have known what she could not verbalize, because he answered, I don't know. I don't know when. I don't know how. And to be honest, I don't care. But I know this much is true. I love you. And I hate myself for not seeing the real you all these years. Colin, don't, she pleaded. No recriminations, no regrets, not tonight. But he just smiled, placing a single finger on her lips to silence her plea. I don't think you changed, he said. At least not very much. But then one day I realized I was seeing something different when I looked at you. He shrugged. Maybe I changed. Maybe I grew up. She placed her finger on his lips, quieting him in the same manner he'd done to her. Maybe I grew up too. I love you, he said, leaning forward to kiss her, and this time she couldn't reply, because his mouth remained on hers, hungry, demanding, and very, very seductive. He seemed to know exactly what to do. Each flick of his tongue, each nibble of his teeth sent shivers to the very core of her being, and she gave herself over to the pure joy of the moment, to the white-hot flame of desire. His hands were everywhere, and she felt him everywhere, his fingers on her skin, his leg nudging its way between hers. He was pulling her closer, rolling her on top of him as he slid onto his back. His hands were on her bottom, pulling her so tightly against him that the proof of his desire seared itself into her skin. Penelope gasped at the astounding intimacy of it all, but her breath was caught by his lips, still kissing her with fierce tenderness. And then she was on her back, and he was on top of her, and the weight of him was pressing her into the mattress, squeezing the air from her lungs. His mouth moved to her ear, then to her throat, and Penelope felt herself arching beneath him, as if she could somehow curve her body closer to his. She didn't know what she was supposed to do, but she knew she had to move. Her mother had already conducted her little talk, as she'd put it, and she'd told Penelope that she must lie still beneath her husband and allow him his pleasures. But there was no way she could have remained motionless, no way she could have stopped her hips from pressing up against him, nor her legs from wrapping around his, and she didn't want to allow him his pleasures. She wanted to encourage them, to share them, and she wanted them for herself as well. Whatever this was, building inside of her, this tension, this desire, it needed release, and Penelope couldn't imagine that that moment those feelings wouldn't be the most exquisite of her life. Tell me what to do, she said, urgency making her voice hoarse. Colin spread her legs wide, running his hands along her sides until they reached her thighs and squeezed. Let me do everything, he said, breathing hard. She grabbed at his buttocks, pulling him closer. No, she insisted. Tell me. He stopped moving for the barest of moments, looking at her in surprise. Touch me, he said. Where? Anywhere. Her hands on his bottom relaxed slightly, and she smiled. I am touching you. Move, he groaned. Move them. She let her fingers drift into his thighs, swirling gently as she felt the soft springiness of hair. Like this? He nodded jerkily. Her hands slid forward until they were dangerously close to his member. Like this? Abruptly, he covered one of her hands with his. Not now, he said harshly. She looked at him in confusion. You'll understand later, he grunted, spreading her legs even wider before sliding his hands between their bodies and touching her most intimate place. Colin, she gasped. He smiled devilishly. Did you think I wouldn't touch you like this? As if to illustrate his point, one of his fingers began to dance across her sensitive flesh, causing her to arch off the bed, her hips actually lifting them both, before sagging back down as she shuddered with desire. His lips found her ear. There's much more, he whispered. Penelope didn't dare ask what. This was already an awful lot more than her mother had mentioned. He slid one finger inside her, causing her to gasp again, which caused him to laugh with delight, then began to stroke her slowly. Oh my gosh, Penelope moaned. You're almost ready for me, he said, his breath coming faster now, so wet, but so tight. Colin, what are you? He slid another finger inside, effectively ending any chance she had for intelligent speech. She felt stretched wide, and yet she loved it. She must be very wicked, a wanton at heart, because all she wanted was to spread her legs wider and wider until she was completely open to him. As far as she was concerned, he could do anything to her, touch her in any way he pleased, just as long as he didn't stop. I can't wait much longer, he gasped. Don't wait. I need you. She reached up and grasped his face, forcing him to look at her. I need you too. And then his fingers were gone. Penelope felt oddly hollow and empty, but only for a second, because then there was something else at her entrance, something hard and hot and very, very demanding. This may hurt, Colin said, gritting his teeth as if he expected pain himself. I don't care. He had to make this good for her. He had to. I'll be gentle, he said, although his desire was now so fierce he had no idea how he could possibly keep such a promise. I want you, she said. I want you, and I need something, and I don't know what. He pushed forward just an inch or so, but it felt like she was swallowing him whole. She went silent beneath him, her only sound, her breath running raggedly across her lips. Another inch, another step closer to heaven. Oh, Penelope, he moaned, using his arms to hold himself above her so as not to crush her with his weight. Please tell me this feels good, please. Because if she said otherwise, it was going to kill him to pull out. She nodded, but said, I need a moment. He swallowed, forcing his breath through his nose in short bursts. It was the only way he could concentrate on holding back. She probably needed to stretch around him to allow her muscles to relax. She'd never taken a man before, and she was so exquisitely tight. All the same, he couldn't wait until they'd had a chance to do this enough so that he didn't have to hold back. When he felt her relax slightly beneath him, he pushed forward a bit more until he reached the undeniable proof of her innocence. Oh gosh, he groaned. This is going to hurt. I can't help it, but I promise you, it's only this one time and it won't hurt much. How do you know? She asked him. He closed his eyes in agony. Trust Penelope to question him. Trust me, he said, weaseling out of the question, and then he thrust forward, embedding himself to the hilt, sinking into her warmth until he knew he was home. Oh, she gasped, her face showing her shock. Are you all right? She nodded. I think so. He moved slightly. Is this all right? She nodded again, but her face looked surprised, maybe a little dazed. Colin's hips began to move off of their own volition, unable to remain still when he was so obviously near to a climax. She was a pure perfection around him, and when he realized that her gasps were of desire and not of pain, he finally let himself go and gave in to the overwhelming desire surging through his blood. She was quickening beneath him, and he prayed that he could hold out until she climaxed. Her breath was fast and hot, and her fingers were pressing relentlessly into his shoulders, and her hips were squirming under him, whipping his need into a near frenzy. And then it came, a sound from her lips, sweeter than anything ever to touch his ears. She cried out his name as her entire body tensed in pleasure, and he thought, someday I will watch her. I will see her face when she reaches the height of pleasure, but not today. He was already coming, and his eyes were shut with the fierce ecstasy of it all. Her name was ripped from his lips as he thrust one last time, then slumped atop her, completely bereft of strength. For a full minute there was silence, nothing but the rise and fall of their chests as they fought for breath, waited for the tremendous rush of their bodies to settle down into that tingly bliss one feels in the arms of one's beloved. Or at least that was what Colin thought this must be. He had been with women before, but he had only just realized that he had never made love until he had laid Penelope onto his bed and begun their intimate dance with a single kiss upon her lips. This was like nothing he'd ever felt before. This was love, and he was going to hold on with both hands. Mm. It was not very difficult to get the wedding date pushed forward. It occurred to Colin as he was returning to his home in Bloomsbury after sneaking an extremely disheveled Penelope into her house in Mayfair, that there might be a very good reason why they should be married sooner rather than later. Of course, it was quite unlikely that she would become pregnant after only one encounter, and he had to admit, even if she did become pregnant, the child would be an 8-month baby, which wasn't too terribly suspect in a world full of children born a mere 6 months or so following a wedding. Not to mention that the first babies were usually late. Colin was uncle to enough nieces and nephews to know this to be true, which would make the baby an 8.5-month baby, which wasn't unusual at all. So really, there was no urgent need to move up the wedding, except that he wanted to. So he had a little talk with the mothers in which he conveyed a great deal without actually saying anything explicit, and they hastily agreed to this plan to rush the wedding, especially since he might have possibly misled them to believe that his and Penelope's intimacies had occurred several weeks prior. Ah, well, little white lies really weren't such a large transgression when they were told to serve the greater good. And a hasty wedding, Colin reflected as he lay in bed each night, reliving his time with Penelope and fervently wishing she were there beside him, definitely served the greater good. The mothers, who had become inseparable in recent days as they planned the wedding, initially protested the change, worrying about unsavory gossip, which in this case would have been entirely true, but Lady Whistledown came, somewhat indirectly, to their rescue. The gossip surrounding Lady Whistledown and Cressida Toomley, and whether the two were actually the same person, raged like nothing London had heretofore seen or heard. In fact, the talk was so ubiquitous, so utterly impossible to escape, that no one paused to consider the fact that the date of the Bridgerton-Featherington wedding had been altered, which suited the Bridgertons and the Featheringtons just fine, except, perhaps, for Colin and Penelope, neither of whom were especially comfortable when talk turned to Lady Whistledown. Penelope was used to it by now, of course. Nary a month had gone by in the past 10 years when someone had not made the idle speculation in her presence about the identity of Lady Whistledown. But Colin was still so upset and angry over her secret life that she'd grown uncomfortable herself. She'd tried to broach the subject with him a few times, but he'd become tight-lipped and told her, in a very un-Colin-like tone, that he didn't want to talk about it. She could only deduce that he was ashamed of her, or if not of her precisely, then of her work as Lady Whistledown, which was like a blow to her heart, because her writing was the one segment in her life that she could point to with a great sense of pride and accomplishment. She had done something, she had, even if she could not put her own name on her work, become a wild success. How many of her contemporaries, male or female, could claim the same? She might be ready to leave Lady Whistledown behind and live her life as Mrs. Colin Bridgerton, wife and mother, but that in no way meant that she was ashamed of what she had done. If only Colin could take pride in her accomplishment as well. Oh, she believed, with every fibre of her being, that he loved her. Colin would never lie about such a thing. He had enough clever words and teasing smiles to make a woman feel happy and content without actually uttering words of love he did not feel. But perhaps it was possible, indeed. After regarding Colin's behavior, she was now sure it was possible that someone could love another person and still feel shame and displeasure with that person. Penelope just hadn't expected it to hurt quite so much. They were strolling through Mayfair one afternoon, just days before the wedding, when she attempted to broach the subject once again. Why, she didn't know, since she couldn't imagine that his attitude would have miraculously changed since the last time she'd mentioned it, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Besides, she was hoping that her position out in public, where all the world could see them, would force Colin to keep a smile on his face and listen to what she had to say. She gauged the distance to number 5, where they were expected for tea. "I think," she said, estimating that she had 5 minutes of conversation before he could usher her inside and change the subject, "that we have unfinished business that we must discuss." He raised a brow and looked at her with a curious but still very playful grin. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. Use his charming and witty personality to steer the conversation where he wanted it. Any minute now that grin would turn boyishly lopsided, and he would say something designed to change the subject without her realizing, something like, "Rather serious for such a sunny day." She pursed her lips. It wasn't precisely what she'd expected, but it certainly echoed the sentiment. "Colin," she said, trying to remain patient, "I wish you wouldn't try to change the subject every time I bring up Lady Whistledown." His voice grew even controlled. I don't believe I heard you mention her name, or I suppose I should say your name. And besides, all I did was compliment the fine weather. Penelope wanted more than anything to plant her feet firmly on the pavement and yank him to a startling halt, but they were in public, her own fault, she supposed, for choosing such a place to initiate the conversation, and so she kept walking, her gait smooth and sedate, even as her fingers curled into tense little fists. The other night, when my last column was published, you were furious with me, she continued. He shrugged. I'm over it. I don't think so. He turned to her with a rather condescending expression. And now you're telling me what I feel? Such a nasty shot could not be unreturned. Isn't that what a wife is supposed to do? You're not my wife yet. Penelope counted to 3. No, better make that 10 before replying. I'm sorry if what I did upset you, but I had no other choice. You had every choice in the world, but I'm certainly not going to debate the issue right here on Bruton Street. And they were on Bruton Street. Oh, brother. Penelope had completely misjudged how quickly they were walking. She only had another minute or so at the most before they ascended the front steps to number 5. I can assure you, she said, that you know who will never again emerge from retirement. I can hardly express my relief. I wish you wouldn't be so sarcastic. He turned to face her with flashing eyes. His expression was so different from the mask of bland boredom that had been there just moments earlier that Penelope nearly backed up a step. Be careful what you wish for, Penelope, he said. The sarcasm is the only thing keeping my real feelings at bay, and believe me, you don't want those in full view. I think I do, she said, her voice quite small, because in truth she wasn't sure that she did. Not a day goes by when I am not forced to stop and consider what on earth I'm going to do to protect you should your secret get out. I love you, Penelope. Gosh help me, but I do. Penelope could have done without the plea of God's help, but the declaration of love was quite nice. In 3 days, he continued, I will be your husband. I will take a solemn vow to protect you until death do us part. Do you understand what that means? You'll save me from marauding minotaurs? She tried to joke. His expression told her he did not find that amusing. I wish you wouldn't be so angry, she muttered. He turned to her with a disbelieving expression, as if he didn't think she had the right to mutter about anything. If I'm angry, it's because I did not appreciate finding out about your last column at the same time as everyone else. She nodded, catching her bottom lip between her teeth before saying, I apologize for that. You certainly had the right to know ahead of time, but how could I have told you? You would have tried to stop me. Exactly. They were now just a few houses away from number 5. If Penelope wanted to ask him anything more, she would have to do it quickly. Are you sure? She began, then cut herself off, not certain if she wanted to finish the question. Am I sure what? She gave her head a little shake. It's nothing. It's obviously something. I was just wondering. She looked to the side, as if the sight of the London cityscape could somehow give her the necessary courage to continue. I was just wondering. Spit it out, Penelope. It was unlike him to be so curt, and his tone prodded her into action. I was wondering, she said, if perhaps you're uneasy with my, secret life, he supplied in a drawl. If that is what you want to call it, she acceded. It had occurred to me that perhaps your unease does not stem entirely from your desire to protect my reputation should I be found out. What precisely, he asked in a clipped tone, do you mean by that? She'd already voiced her question. There was nothing to do now but supply complete honesty. I think you're ashamed of me. He stared at her for 3 full seconds before answering. I'm not ashamed of you. I told you once already I wasn't. What then? Colin's steps faltered, and before he realized what his body was doing, he was standing still in front of number 3, Bruton Street. His mother's home was only 2 houses away, and he was fairly certain they were expected for tea about 5 minutes ago, and he couldn't quite get his feet to move. I'm not ashamed of you, he said, again, mostly because he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, that he was jealous, jealous of her achievements, jealous of her. It was such a distasteful feeling, such an unpleasant emotion. It ate at him, creating a vague sense of shame every time someone mentioned Lady Whistledown, which, given the tenor of London's current gossip, was about 10 times each day, and he wasn't quite certain what to do about it. His sister Daphne had once commented that he always seemed to know what to say, how to set others at ease. He'd thought about that for several days after she'd said it, and he'd come to the conclusion that his ability to make others feel good about themselves must stem from his own sense of self. He was a man who had always felt supremely comfortable in his own skin. He didn't know why he was so blessed. Perhaps it was good parents, maybe simple luck. But now he felt awkward and uncomfortable, and it was spilling into every corner of his life. He snapped at Penelope, he barely spoke at parties, and it was all due to his detestable jealousy and its attendant shame. Or was it? Would he be jealous of Penelope if he hadn't already sensed a lack in his own life? It was an interesting psychological question, or at least it would be if it were about anyone else but him. My mother will be expecting us, he said curtly, knowing that he was avoiding the issue and hating himself for it, but quite unable to do anything else. And your mother will be there as well, so we had better not be late. We're already late, she pointed out. He took her arm and tugged her toward number 5. All the more reason not to dally. You're avoiding me, she said. How can I be avoiding you if you're right here on my arm? That made her scowl. You're avoiding my question. We will discuss it later, he said, when we are not standing in the middle of Bruton Street, with heaven knows whom staring at us through their windows. And then, to demonstrate that he would brook no further protest, he placed his hand at her back and steered her none too gently up the steps to number 5. One week later, nothing had changed except Penelope reflected her last name. The wedding had been magical. It was a small affair, much to the dismay of London society, and the wedding night, well, that had been magical too. And in fact, marriage was magical. Colin was a wonderful husband, teasing, gentle, attentive, except when the topic of Lady Whistledown arose. Then he became, well, Penelope wasn't sure what he became, except that he was not himself. Gone was his easy grace, his glib tongue, everything wonderful that made him the man she'd loved for so very long. In a way, it was almost funny. For so long, all of her dreams had revolved around marrying this man, and at some point those dreams had come to include her telling him about her secret life. How could they not? In Penelope's dreams, her marriage to Colin had been a perfect union, and that meant complete honesty. In her dreams, she sat him down, shyly revealed her secret. He reacted first with disbelief, then with delight and pride. How remarkable she was to have fooled all of London for so many years. How witty to have written such clever turns of phrase. He admired her for her resourcefulness, praised her for her success. In some of the dreams, he even suggested that he become her secret reporter. It had seemed the sort of thing Colin would enjoy, just the sort of amusing, devious task that he would relish. But that wasn't the way it turned out. He said he wasn't ashamed of her, and maybe he even thought that was true, but she couldn't quite bring herself to believe him. She'd seen his face when he swore that all he wanted was to protect her, but protectiveness was a fierce, burning feeling, and when Colin was talking about Lady Whistledown, his eyes were shuttered and flat. She tried not to feel disappointed. She tried to tell herself that she had no right to expect Colin to live up to her dreams, that her vision of him had been unfairly idealized, but she still wanted him to be the man she'd dream of, and she felt so guilty for every pang of disappointment. This was Colin, for heaven's sake, Colin, who was as close to perfect as any human being could ever hope to be. She had no right to find fault with him, and yet she did. She wanted him to be proud of her. She wanted it more than anything in the world, more even than she'd wanted him all those years when she'd watched him from afar. But she cherished her marriage, and awkward moments aside, she cherished her husband, and so she stopped mentioning Lady Whistledown. She was tired of Colin's hooded expression. She didn't want to see the tight lines of displeasure around his mouth. It wasn't as if she could avoid the topic forever. Any trip out into society seemed to bring mention of her alter ego, but she didn't have to introduce the subject at home. And so, as they sat at breakfast one morning, chatting amiably as they each perused that morning's paper, she searched for other topics. "Do you think we shall take a honeymoon trip?" she asked, spreading a generous portion of raspberry jam on her muffin. She probably ought not to eat so much, but the jam was really quite tasty, and besides, she always ate a lot when she was anxious. She frowned first at the muffin and then at nothing in particular. She hadn't realized she was so anxious. She'd thought she'd been able to push the Lady Whistledown problem to the back of her mind. "Perhaps later in the year," Colin replied, reaching for the jam once she was through with it. "Pass me the toast, would you?" She did so silently. He glanced up, either at her or over at the plate of kippers. She couldn't be sure. "You look disappointed," he said. She supposed she should be flattered that he looked up from his food, or maybe he was looking at the kippers and she just got in the way. Probably the latter. It was difficult to compete with food for Colin's attention. "Penelope?" he queried. She blinked. "You look disappointed," he reminded her. "Oh, yes, well, I am, I suppose." She gave him a faltering smile. "I've never been anywhere, and you've been everywhere, and I guess I thought you could take me someplace you especially liked. Greece, perhaps, or maybe Italy. I've always wanted to see Italy." "You would like it," he murmured, distractedly, his attention more on his eggs than on her. "Venice especially, I think. Then why don't you take me? I will, he said, sparing a pink piece of bacon and popping it into his mouth. Just not now. Penelope licked a bit of jam off her muffin and tried not to look too crestfallen. If you must know, Colin said with a sigh, the reason I don't want to leave is... He glanced at the open door, his lips pursing with annoyance. Well, I can't say it here. Penelope's eyes widened. You mean... She traced a large W on the tablecloth. Exactly. She stared at him in surprise, a bit startled that he had brought up the subject, and even more so that he didn't seem terribly upset by it. But why? She finally asked. Should the secret come out, he said cryptically, just in case there were any servants about, which there usually were, I should like to be in town to control the damage. Penelope deflated in her chair. It was never pleasant to be referred to as damage. Which was what he had done. Well, indirectly at least. She stared at her muffin, trying to decide if she was hungry. She wasn't. Not really. But she ate it anyway.